morning, everybody. My name is Rory Sullivan. I am the CEO of Chronos Sustainability. My only job is to finish at 5 to 12. The rest of the work, the heavy lifting, is going to be done by the panel to start with, and then in a move away from conference convention, we're then going to go to the audience. If there are no questions from the audience, I'm going to pick on people. So particularly anybody who looks like he or she has been drowsing off or not paying attention. So pay attention, have a question lined up just in case I look at you or make eye contact with you. Okay, today's panel is about the Net Zero Balancing Act. So what does net zero mean for investment organizations? How do they navigate the challenges it presents? We have a, I was going to say distinguished, but actually I want to say diverse rather than distinguished, because I think diverse is probably more useful for this audience. We have a regulator, an asset owner, an asset manager, and a jack of all trades, who doubles occasionally as the head of the Transition Pathway Initiative. And I think what this makes this quite an interesting panel, because actually a lot of the issues and challenges in net zero are not just within the organization, but they're in the interactions between these different stakeholders and what they need from others in order to deliver on their net zero objectives and commitments. So what I've asked each of the panelists to do is to very quickly introduce themselves. David, less than half an hour ideally, but let's see how you go. And I've asked them each to answer the question, which is, what is the biggest challenge they, in their organization or in their professional roles, depending on where they sit, have faced in relation to net zero, and what is the one thing they've done, what intervention or action have they taken that has enabled them to get through that? So each of the panelists will give that introduction, introduce themselves, biggest challenge, the key action they've taken to address it, and we're then going to the audience. Now the running order is going to be, David Russell's kindly said he'll go first, then Naomi, then Sonja, and then Mark, as the regulator, whom we've all got to listen to very carefully and respect. So that's basically the agenda. So David, would you like to start? And welcome, and thank you.
Sure, thanks, Rory. And just as a very brief background, I'm currently chair of the Transition Pathway Initiative, which provides data to investors around the world to track how companies and countries now are transitioning. Prior to that, I was head of responsible investment at USS for a number of years, and Naomi can introduce USS. But the interesting thing is it's an asset owner and an asset manager. So it covers both parts of how pension funds operate and implement their investment decision-making processes. Net zero and the targets that pension funds set around it. Firstly, I think it's really important that pension funds do set targets or ambitions, if you've got lawyers in the room, which we do, being in a law firm. Setting targets for where the world needs to be, where your fund needs to be by 2050 is really important. It sends signals to the market, it sends signals to regulators and the policymakers, particularly because they'll be getting counter signals from industry pushing back on the regulations that will need to be in place to get us to net zero. So sending that signal by pension funds is really important. In fact, large pension funds kind of have to set these targets because the regulator made us do TCFD reporting, and one of the things within TCFD reporting is what targets have you set. So you have to set targets for the long term, the medium term, and the short term. So looking at these long-term targets, most pension funds are putting in place 2050 targets because that's kind of where Europe said it's going to go. That's kind of said, that's Paris aligned. We need to be well below 2 degrees by 2050. That's kind of net zero. We have some funds putting in place more stringent targets. So some have said 2040, some have said 2035. And that's a really punchy target, particularly seeing as it's been set by a UK closed defined benefit scheme, which is invested largely in gilts. So for it to hit its targets, the UK needs to be net zero by 2035, i.e. in slightly more than 10 years' time. And that's kind of not really going to happen. So you have to think very carefully about the targets you set. The other thing to think about in terms of the short, medium, and long-term targets, the long-term target that pension funds are setting is an absolute target. We need to be net zero by 2050. The interim targets tend to be relative targets, what's the right word? Intensity-based. So your assets, your emissions divided by your assets. Now that seems like a good idea because pension funds are growing, or hope to be, because that's what you want, investment returns for your money. The challenge is, at some point in the near future, that switch between the intensity-based targets and the absolute target needs to be achieved. And that's a challenge that most pension funds have not yet started thinking about. Okay, when do we do this and how is it going to impact us? The other thing that's important to realize about these interim targets, absolute is everything, or should be. The interim targets tend to be focused on specific asset classes, and you carve out certain things. Many pension funds have carved out sovereign debt because it's in the too hard to deal with bucket at the moment. So the interim targets kind of just cover your corporate type targets. And the IIGCC, the Investor Group on Climate Change, did some published a report earlier this year which looked at it. It's the members of the Net Zero Asset Owner Group that it runs, Paris-aligned investor group that it runs. And people have their targets varying from 2% of their assets, which is kind of, if you're USS, that could be an asset. Very small coverage, up to 100%, with most kind of like 52% of their assets covered. Everyone seems to cover their public equity portfolios, and then you get a decreasing coverage of targets around things like credit. Then you get your alternatives, and you've got your others and your sovereign, which people don't really set targets for. So I think the challenge that I'm seeing with these targets is, okay, how do we switch from this intensity-based, where most people are, to the absolute that we know we need to deliver in the next 27 years, 26 years, do my maths. That's why I'm not a fund manager, it's 26 years. The solution is, God knows.
So David, that's basically sidestepping this question you asked, which
of course it is.
Which is, but do you want to maybe point to, I don't know, you could use tools like TPI to help you in your process as a possible...
So I think that one of the challenges that the target's been set is that because of the way TCFD works, the major focus of the reporting is a number. It's your carbon footprint, because that's relatively easy to measure. Yeah, you get some data that's good, you get some that are estimated, but you come up with a number that says this is your carbon footprint for whichever asset classes that you've chosen to focus on. The challenge is that's a backward-looking number that is out of date when you get it, because it's usually 2 years of data out of date, and it doesn't tell you where your assets are going to be. And I think that where pension funds I know are beginning to think and are moving is, let's look at the forward-looking indicators where companies could be going. What are they doing on their R&D spend? How are they setting targets for actually achieving net zero in their own business operations? So I think a shift away from the carbon footprint, this is where my portfolio was. Because all the carbon footprint tells you, usually, is you're investing in cement companies, steel companies, utilities. It's the users of energy that actually cause the emissions, not usually the providers of energy. So you're focusing on heavy carbon assets. And it's easy to actually achieve your targets each year because you just have to sell a few of them. It's easy to gain a carbon footprint. If you look at how the numbers stack up, roughly 10% of the portfolio will cover kind of 70-80% of the emissions. So you just sell a few of them each year, and you'll hit your 6% a year decrease, which you have to do to get from where we are now to net zero by 2050. More forward-looking, how companies are setting targets, where they're going, how they're going to transition themselves, I think gets us to a better place in terms of how we transition our portfolios, or you lot transition your portfolios, rather than just having a number that is easy to gain.
Thanks, David. So Naomi, as a representative of you lot, to use David's kind term, would you like to comment on...
Yeah.
Well, introduce yourself, please.
Sure.
Challenges, and then maybe how you've started to address them. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm Naomi Clark. I run the investment product team at USS. USS is, I think, still the biggest UK pension fund at around 80 billion of assets. We've got quite a unique structure, so we're sort of majority DB benefits, about 77 billion, and then we have about 3 billion in like a DC top up for those higher earners. So we kind of see both sides of the pensions landscape. The investment product team that I look after covers things like whether we invest internally or externally, so those decisions that we make, selecting the external managers. We run the DC platform and investment solution, and we also do all the kind of fiduciary and client advice, because David was actually not completely right when he said we're an asset manager and asset owner. We're actually also an investment consultant. Yep. So we provide all of the investment advice through to the trustee, which I think it makes us quite unique, and brings with it its own challenges. So yeah, good fun and games doing all that. I think the challenge that I would touch on is quite broad. I think for us, the single biggest challenge that we face, or that we think we face actually, not just for climate, but for us with our whole sort of RI approach, is really that these are systemic issues. We're a large universal owner. There's no way that we can invest or disinvest our way around these issues. So, this is a big challenge that we face, and I think for us, we've been thinking broadly around how we can respond to these systemic level challenges like climate change. I think for us, we've got a very long time frame. We think that it's very challenging to influence global policy. Global policy is increasingly quite unaligned, particularly on climate. I think this is a big systemic level challenge that we face. We find that there's a real lack of alignment in the investment chain. I think asset owners and asset managers face different commercial, political, asset raising or not pressures. And I think that's a real challenge. So I guess, well, what can we do about all of that? Well, I think we as a large global asset owner, we're not bound by political cycles. We have got this long time frame. I think we think that increasingly it's important to have our own voice, to think carefully about where we can engage. I think for us, global engagement is something that is probably never going to be productive, but we can have focused UK engagements, and we can partner with other global asset owners to have a voice globally if we're selective with the partners that we select to do that. I think then kind of coming down a level, I think capital allocation, it will increasingly be important. For us, kind of echoing what David said, I think setting targets and trying to sort of divest your way to those targets, it's not going to affect real world change. It doesn't reduce that systemic risk that we face. I think when we have done that, we do have mandates that, divest a certain amount every year. I don't think we think that that's the way to solve this problem for the future and for the long term. I think we think that, energy transition focused strategies, particularly in private markets, we do a lot of energy, like renewable energy investments, these very focused transition assets, I think will go a long way to solving some of that. And then kind of coming down another level into micro stewardship, I think this is a place where as a large asset owner, you can have a really strong voice. You can't do that with every company you own though, so you really need to pick the companies that you think are going to work with you, and don't own those that won't, which is something that we're doing at the moment. And then finally, and sort of really relating back to what David said, I think thought leadership and kind of academic research is an area that we've really focused on over the last year. So we've been in partnership with Exeter University, developing kind of climate scenario analysis that we're integrating into our asset allocation process. And then the project that we're doing at the moment is to start to develop in conjunction with Exeter forward-looking metrics, which we will then be able to use in order to build out our asset allocation and help with all of those things, all the sort of other building blocks that I've spoken about. But I think it's a massive problem and the solution is quite broad, and we haven't solved it yet, but we've got some ideas around where we need to focus.
Brilliant. Thank you, Naomi. Audience, be prepared. Your time is coming. Sonja, could I go to you, please? Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Sonja LAUD, I'm the Chief Investment Officer at Legal & General Asset Management. So I'm sitting in between both Naomi and David. And you know, Legal & General is the largest pension fund manager here in the UK. We're a global asset manager. We're having around 1.3 trillion assets under management. And starting off with, as the asset manager, it is not our own money we're investing. We are bound by the fiduciary duty, and I'm stressing this because that has real implications on how you look at the transition to net zero. It is the client's objective that will, of course, guide the principle around this. And as Naomi just said, you will have different objectives. There will be different clients that will set their own targets. It's not always just transition to net zero. There will be other principles that need to be put forward. And I can't stress enough, Naomi, what you have just said. Even if each individual pension fund here in the UK were to reach the net zero target, it might have a minimal impact on the real world problem we're trying to address. And it's not just that we're not globally aligned, i.e. even financial markets are not globally aligned. We can't even agree on specific metrics. We can't agree on the time frames. We can't agree on the intensity versus the absolute targets. We can't even agree what net actually means. We're always talking about net zero. Net means that there's something on the other side, right? That nets actually your position. So that we haven't even started, which is a very interesting aspect. But at the end of the day, it is a system-wide solution. It's not even just financial markets. If we can't put the right incentive structures in place that changes consumer behavior, that changes the incentives for corporates really to evolve, we will face a massive uphill battle. Now, what does it all mean for the asset manager? It means that, of course, we have to work with clients to understand how we can help them to achieve their objectives. Objectives are normally still, first and foremost, financial returns. The industry is here to deliver the right credible investment propositions. There is a third dimension that increasingly is put forward by our clients that says this is the financial risk return metrics that we're putting forward, but please, can you add net zero as the third dimension to this? Now, as we all know, if you have a three-dimensional problem to solve, that optimization has trade-offs. Inevitably has to, because we have mismatches in time horizon, we have mismatches in the way how these long-term targets will influence financial returns, and this is what we need to square to make sure that we can deliver against all of these. And that very often will start with exclusions. You said it very nicely. Of course, I can create you a net zero line portfolio every day of the week in just getting rid of the dirty stuff. Will this have a real world impact? No, of course not. And that is, I think, where we need to be far more open with the limitations on how the investment universe and the investment propositions we can put forward are good. And of course, I don't want to diminish that they will have an impact, but we should not kid ourselves that this will solve climate change. I'm exaggerating for a fact here, but that is still where we find sometimes a real disconnect between the understanding of what we can and what we can't do. And this is why I've been stressing so much that if we as consumers don't change, if the government cannot provide the right framework, if we don't see the right long-term structural investments in renewables, we will not get there. It is just very simply a matter of fact. Now, what we have started to do as a first principle is that climate risks are an inherent part of the analysis of individual companies. So the reason why we're doing this, how you bring it all together, the financial returns with a real world outcome, is financial materiality. And we all agree by now, a company that ignores climate risks will see a detrimental impact on its financials in the future. That in and of itself, all of a sudden brings the third dimension fully aligned with the two other dimensions. And that's how this is now a very common project, even if you don't have necessarily net zero target, why this should be included. And I think that's been a massive step forward. Do we have perfect data? No, but with that understanding, at least, I think we're moving towards the right proposition. Now, the balancing act is exactly that dilemma that I've just outlined. And I believe that one aspect that we need to be far more focused on is the dirty stuff. Because we can't, it's not black and white. We cannot ignore oil and gas because then we're switching the lights off. And this is where the debate has to stop being black and white. It is not one versus the other. It's called a transition because it's a transition, because we're gradually moving away from what we are knowing as carbon-heavy sectors towards of course, renewable energy and a green transition. But it will not happen overnight. And it's that understanding that we need to push for, and it's the laggards we need to focus on. So the proposition we have been putting forward, that we're focusing a lot more on, is working with the laggards. It's only 25% of the MSCI world that actually is on a good pathway to be net zero aligned. That leaves an awful lot of companies that need support and help. This is not a stick approach. This is working with companies to demonstrate and illustrate the financial risks these companies are taking if they're not moving. And there is very sophisticated asset owners that we are working with, and it's public knowledge. It's AP7 in Sweden that was looking for a partner that works with them on working with the laggards. So what's the intrinsic proposition? You use engagement to unlock the value proposition that is within the company. And the way you engage with the company is you need a benefit statement. What's in it for them? What's the incentive? And it is that financial materiality that lands so well, because you're coming in as a partner. You're coming in to say, please, can we help? Because then all of a sudden you have positive externalities, you have a positive impact on financials, and as such you can really fulfill your fiduciary duty to deliver against the three dimensions. But we're not doing enough of that. We need to shift a lot more. Now then you come to the one piece that is difficult for us, it's labor intensive. You need a skill set that the industry never had in the past. You need climate experts that can sit in front of the BP CEO and deliver a value add to the CEO because of the knowledge they have. And that's a shift that's not easy. And as I said, doing this across a broad range of companies requires a lot of skill and a lot of people. Now you're all aware of the fee pressures, so you have a direct conflict of interest in how you can make it work. But I think it's such an important piece of the jigsaw on how you add a valuable proposition to what are already good propositions. It's not that you get rid of what you already have, but you acknowledge that it's not a one-fits-all and that you need several components in order to move forward.
Excellent. Thanks, Sonja. Moving to Mark.
How do you follow that? So, right, so
Impressively.
Thank you. So Mark, I lead on climate and sustainability of the pensions regulator. So what have we been finding as key challenges? Well, we're constrained by the regulations, first and foremost. But one of the key things, and Sonja, you touched on it, was that navigation of fiduciary duty is one of the key challenges out there. I mean, we sat on the FLMC working group as an observer when they prepared their fiduciary duty paper. Subsequently, we've been supporting DWP with their fiduciary duty roundtables in order to get that conversation moving forward and reach a consensus. So we're looking forward to the next roundtable when it's scheduled, and hopefully we'll get consensus out of that. It might be some additional guidance from either ourselves or DWP. It might even involve some tweak of legislation, possibly, I don't know. But I say fiduciary duty has been a key challenge, but equally trustee understanding and expertise. This is a rapidly evolving space. They have a lot to do, and anecdotally from talking to trustees, they've got to grips with climate. Now they've got nature on the horizon. They've got transition planning coming. They've got social factors to deal with. They've got the issues around double materiality and the impacts on reputation, on brand as well if they get things wrong. So it's a big challenge for them. And as TPR, we're here to help. So we've put out various blogs and articles encouraging trustees to get up to speed with things like the TNFD. We've also recently launched a landing page on our internet site which has links to various bits of key guidance out there. And it's very much about being that handrail now for trustees, but equally noting concerns that have been raised by organisations such as the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries around the overall competence across the sector. They referred to the fact that their main concern is there isn't enough expertise at the right level, be it within the public sector, the regulators, be it within the advisory sector, and those that are advising trustees. So they've raised that as a key concern, and that's quite a challenge. In terms of looking forward, I say we as a regulator committed in 2021 to play our part in the transition. So in the next financial year, we are developing and publishing our own transition plan. We've been doing All the homework this year, checking our carbon inventory, having that assured, finding the gaps, putting in place targets for 2030 and 2050, looking at a science-based target in particular for 2050, because as we discovered, 97% of our footprint is scope 3, and data is a particular challenge there. But equally, we're very aware of reporting burden. Schemes have got to deal with what's happening in the EU. They've also got the UK. And again, TCFD, we've all discussed and touched on, it's backward-looking. Transition plans are forward-looking. There are voices out there that maybe transition plans should supersede TCFD and any subsequent sustainability disclosure because of that forward-looking element to them. So again, we're very much involved in conversations around that and want to continue having those discussions and helping shape that practice and disclosure moving forward.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Okay, audience, who wants to go first? Okay, lady at the front. And then who's going to be second? Can I have a hand? Okay, second is going back. Right, off you go. Okay, shout. Yeah. No. Yeah, go for it.
TCFD is very backwards looking, but what we need is forward looking ambitions, etc. But at some point the ambitions do become what's backwards looking, and what I mean with that is companies have been setting targets since, let's say, 2018, which was 6 years ago. So by now we also need to start looking at the track record of, well, have they been actually decarbonizing? And one thing we see is many of our corporates will say, oh, but that's fine, I'm just going to keep doing business as usual in order to keep it profitable, which speaks to the fiduciary duty of investors. And one of my clients actually pointed this out. There was an oil and gas company that did this when they had a 2020 target, and then in 2019 they spun off one of their high emitting assets and they hit their target, but they didn't actually meet their decarbonization ambitions. And I just want to hear your thoughts about this. Like how are you engaging with clients?
Okay.
What is it beyond the track record?
Okay, I think we got the question. Go, panel, answer it. And then you're next.
So I can jump in at the start. On the targets thing, obviously I'm biased here. TPI tracks how companies are setting targets. And what we're finding is like 30% of the companies that we assess, around 1,000 companies, have net zero targets. So that's great. They set targets for 2050. The challenge is they're not putting in place targets that are aligned with a transition pathway for the short term and the medium term, 2025 and 2035. So they're backloading the emissions, and that's no good for the climate because basically the CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere. So you might hit your 2050 target, but by that time the world is never going to hit the 2050 target because you've put too much stuff in the atmosphere. So I think it's really important that companies are held to account for the targets they are setting, being aligned with where they need to be over time, or explaining how they're going to get there, because that's the other thing. What transition plans are they putting in place? Even if their short-term targets are not there, they may be putting in place research and development funding that will enable them to get there slightly in the longer term. So I think that's really important, and engaging with companies around that is critical. The other point is companies are going backwards. I mean, there's no doubt that some particularly large oil and gas companies have reduced their targets over the short term for political and for economic and other reasons. And I think as investors, we should be asking them why they're doing that.
Okay. Sonja, and then we'll go to gentleman at the back.
It's I'm coming back to some extent to the incentive system as well, and the fact that we are always talking about corporates, but we're not putting equal pressure on consumers to change. And I think that is not quite fair, because there's a number of stakeholders involved for companies as well that they need to address and that they need to cater to. It's difficult as well to have a number of KPIs and then being able as a company to align the strategy in a way that it always adds up perfectly to the pathway we've put forward. So you mentioned the asset sale, and that of course might have been part of the overall transition journey, but came at a point where it might look like it's the only way how they can get there. That is difficult. We're talking about multi-decade transitions. And we, of course, have selected starting points, which I would always call as an inventory, because you, of course, need to have a start date in order to judge whether the forward-looking transition is the right one and whether it works. There's one very important aspect, because we're talking about oil and gas as stranded assets. We're not giving them credit if they actually keep the dirty stuff and make them better, because we're literally forcing them in order to meet the targets to get rid of them. And then, of course, there's always a willing buyer that runs it for cash and doesn't really care about the environmental impact. We haven't solved for it, but we're putting so much pressure on this one industry that I think requires a better, more constructive debate how we deal with that and how we can embed those assets in particular into the broader setting of targets and ambitions. One final aspect, particularly true for the oil and gas industry. The market is not giving these companies any credit for what they're doing. They're discounting machines, right? If the oil price goes up, profits go up, share price goes up. This was really interesting if you consider the period we've just been through, that actually the ones that have done the heavy lifting were penalized compared to those that haven't, because of course the more the direct oil you produce, the better your share price. That is a direct conflict, because of course shareholders will be unhappy. We haven't solved the time mismatch between doing the right thing and the way the market will recognize companies for it. And we just have to recognize the company. If you sit in the boardroom and you have multiple stakeholders to cater for, it's not easy. And I'm coming back to the incentive system that would address a lot of this, because you provide an immediate incentive, a financial incentive, if we think about carbon tax, for companies to change and to change faster, and for the market to be able to quantify it.
Thanks, Sonia. So I'm going to go to the gentleman here, and then I see lady with blonde hair, Vicky Bashi, and then here. So if we do all 4 questions, and then we'll distribute them amongst the panel. And then I will come to Maria Nazarovas-Doyle's side of the room.
Sorry, we haven't got the microphone working, so you're just going to have to shout. Actually, we might have it. I can see we have
Just start shouting.
Hello, hello.
Oh, yeah, that works.
Right.
Okay, where am I going first?
Gentleman in the centre, please.
Put your hand up wherever you are, please.
Yeah.
Right, thank you. Hi.
And can I ask everybody
loud.
short, punchy questions, please? We haven't got much time.
Okay, Peter Backman, Gresham House. I want to try to address somewhat of the elephant in the room, in the sense that we can't keep investing in the same things and expect a different outcome. And we can't currently allocate pension capital in many respects into illiquid assets because of various mechanisms that I think could be changed. How does the panel think about it, particularly the regulator, think about unlocking the capital that's needed to really transition? Because at the moment, illiquids are 2%, 3%, 4% maybe of asset allocation. We need it to be a lot more.
Yep. Yeah. Excellent question. Mark, that's coming to you, and maybe Naomi, I might ask you to comment as well. So there were 2 questions at the back, Vicky and the lady in front of you. Thank you. And then you. Up.
Hello, hi, it's Linda Carmody from Better Society Capital. We're a UK social impact investor. When we think about the transition, we think about just transition. And I particularly wanted to maybe find out a bit more about what Sonia means when she talks about the individual behaviour, because our research and the work we do really points to the fact that people can't afford to do the transition. Absolutely. And so who is the individual and what the behaviour you're trying to change? Because people want to, and that's the question.
And sorry, and you're referring to companies wanting to transition?
No, individuals.
Individuals. Okay, got it. Okay, Vicky, please.
Yeah. Hi, thanks. So you've all talked a little about the problems with carbon footprint. Oh, sorry. Vicky Bakshi from Columbia Threadneedle Investments. So you've all talked a little about the drawbacks of carbon footprinting and paper decarbonisation, and then Mark, you touched on transition plans and coming down the road, potentially mandatory transition plans. But at the same time, a lot of asset owners are locked into carbon footprint targets. Do you think some of those are going to start to get dropped, or should they be?
Okay, thank you. And then can we take the question? Oh, are you going to sneak a question in? No? Okay, sorry, there was one question here at the front. David, I might get you to take on the carbon footprinting question. And Sonia, question for you.
Just
and
transition, yeah.
Mark, and then this question here. No, the lady just here in the second row. Thank you.
Thank you.
Elena Budron from IIGCC. I'm delighted to see a big asset manager and asset owner who is investing heavily in indexed passive assets, and I want to know what are your thoughts on how do we make these assets work harder in terms of engagement? Thank you.
Excellent, great question. And David, you might want to comment on that as well when we get to you. But Mark, could I maybe start with you and Naomi on the question of, can we invest in liquid assets? Is this feasible? What role do they play in net zero?
It's a really good question, and I don't have a really good answer as a regulator.
You can park. You can say.
I'm happy to.
Do you want to, Mark? Do you want to take any of the other questions that came up?
Yeah, more than happy to.
Well, which one would you like? You can choose one.
Let's go for the carbon footprint targets.
Okay. So do you want to answer it?
Yep. Right. So it is a great question, because when you look at how we've traditionally approached things from a regulatory perspective, it's about savers' outcomes, it's about protecting those or enhancing them. So you've been focused very much on portfolio resilience, investment strategy resilience, enhancing that to the impacts of things like climate change, nature loss, biodiversity. But that does not necessarily translate into a real-world outcome to the extent that you might think it does. And again, that's what the panel has touched on already. So I can see that when you're getting into transition planning and you're starting to look at moving forward, there is a dilemma there that if you look at a strict alignment where you are seeking just to reduce that carbon figure year on year, are you going to drive capital? And you're looking at those carbon footprint targets. Are you going to drive capital away from those companies and firms and interests that are very key to the transition? You know, those that are producing the heat pumps, those that are producing the EV batteries and the EVs. And is that going to, as an unintended consequence? And is there therefore a role for the idea of scope 4 emissions, the actual emissions that you have saved by investing in those products, rather than looking strictly at, okay, I've got this downward trajectory in terms of carbon emissions, that's great, but is that actually going to deliver the real world transition? Probably not. So yeah, I think you're right. There'll have to be taking a step back and looking again at those carbon footprinting targets within the frame of what is the transition trying to achieve? Where should that capital be going?
Naomi, before I come to you, David, I might ask you do you want to add anything on the carbon footprinting or kind of portfolio assessment and measurement more generally?
Sure. I mean, I think that we're stuck with the tyranny of the benchmark and the carbon footprint. It's easy to measure and it's easy to communicate. It doesn't tell you very much, apart from you've got a lot of carbon in your portfolio. Don't get me started on the temperature-related target, because that's just rubbish. But yeah, so I think we're stuck with the carbon footprinting part of reporting. I think what pension funds and asset managers need to do is have a bit of courage to say, actually, we're not going to hit the target this time because we're investing in X cement company or Y steel company, because they've got a really good transition plan and they are the ones that are going to be around in 20, 30 years' time. So we're supporting them. But what it means is we've missed our target this year. Right? So it's a communications issue, and got to have the strength to stand up to the Divest USS and the others who will shout at the funds because they're not hitting their target. We have to transition. Transition's not going to be a straight line or easy, but I don't think we'll get away from the carbon footprint because it's an easy number to.
I think there's one wider point, which is probably a point to the regulator, if I may, Mark, which is I think a lot of people have, when they set net zero commitments, they framed it in terms of a particular target, and I think it takes a long time to get out of a target once you've set it, and a long time to get out of a particular, like implied temperature rise. It's going to take 20 years for people to stop using an unsensical metric because it's gone into regulation, into expectations. And I think there's something in, as this industry grows up and it's in its engagement with climate change, about understanding that it is, once something gets set, it takes a long time for them to change or to work through or to change a fund prospectus or objectives. Okay, Naomi, back to illiquid assets. Can it be done? Should it be done?
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, yeah, it definitely can be done because we're doing it.
Why do you think the question's gone your way?
So yes, I think it can. I agree. I mean, it is challenging, and it's not something that is easy to do, but I do think it's important that schemes focus on this, not actually just from a responsible investment net carbon zero transition perspective, but actually just from best financial interests of members. Like we do see yield premiums in private markets. So we have significant sort of 30, 35, sometimes up to 40% of our DB fund invested in private assets. The majority of those are assets that we directly hold ourselves, so not via a fund, which means that we can take a seat on a board, we can really influence management, work with them on all aspects of running the business, including net carbon zero. And in our DC section, actually, we now have 25% of our fund allocated to illiquid investments, and that's all really directly held investments or co-investments. There are obviously more fee pressures in DC around things like the private equity funds, but there are other schemes like Nest, for example, that don't have large in-house teams like we do that have managed to do that. So I do think that there are steps being made in the right direction. I think the other really sort of positive area with private markets is that we have seen that if you are focused on sort of owning the transition, which you know I spoke a bit about, you know, capital allocation being one of our levers. We do see that there are often more embryonic technologies, early stage investments that you can make in private markets to sort of fund the transition and own the transition that you don't see as much in listed markets. These sort of more types of assets. So I think it is something that we all need to focus on. I do think things like the LTAF and some of the mansion house sort of rhetoric that we've heard from the government, there is commitment to make this easier, but I agree it's still challenging for schemes to do that. Yeah. Do you want me to touch on the passive one while I'm chatting?
Oh, go on.
Or, and then obviously take your perspective.
David, I might, if you want to comment on passive as well, and then Sonia, you'll get passive and retail.
Yeah.
Then there's one more question, and then I've got a killer wrap-up question, and we're going to be done in about 2 minutes, but let's go.
So I think for us, we completely agree around making passive work harder. I mean, we do believe in active management, and we don't have, by any means, the majority of our assets passively managed, but we do have a significant passive allocation. I think there's a couple of things that we've done there to kind of help with that. So the first thing is we designed a custom benchmark for our passive asset allocation in conjunction with Solactive and our manager Elgin. And that was really sort of predominantly proprietary quant work that we did internally. Which means that those assets are Paris-aligned and they do transition. We may well revisit that as we think about kind of more forward-looking metrics, and there may be a way we can incorporate that. It's a big sort of piece of work in progress at the moment, but I think there are ways to make passive work harder from a benchmark perspective. And then the other thing is, so we do all the voting and engagement with the companies that we own, regardless of whether they're in segregated mandates, pooled mandates, internally managed, externally managed. And for us, that is important. I think as a large asset owner, you have got a significant amount of capital allocated. If you have got a smart benchmark and companies are aware of the fact that you are designing the benchmark and responding to changes, and potentially would exclude companies despite it being passively managed, because for us, we've already made that decision to go away from a broad-based market index. So we are happy to exclude companies that we can't engage with or don't engage. And I think that is a way to sort of make those assets work harder for you. It obviously does require resource internally to do that, and as Sonia was saying, it's skilled resource and it's time consuming, but it can be done. Sonia?
Yes, I would echo these points, and of course what NAOMI has highlighted in her remit unfortunately doesn't necessarily translate if you look at the overall volume of index mandates that are out there. And the big question, are all these assets doing enough to make it work? Because as NAOMI has rightly said, you cannot assume that we can engage with every index constituent the same way as you can with a more concentrated active portfolio. That is still a challenge, and we have to be very clear in what level of engagement we can deliver and we can't. There, of course, is through the active engagement is a halo effect. And this is why I said earlier, we have to do more of this, because inevitably then you shine a light on the areas where this probably hasn't happened. But that's a big ask, and I think needs a far more open debate of what can and can't be done. Because clearly we have a large index book. If you look at the likes of BlackRock and Vanguard, are we really doing enough to make those assets work? there's inevitably a question: if you pay 3 basis points for your index fund, can you really, can I make it work to have the people and the human resource available to do this, right? So, and this requires an open debate. By the way, likewise, private markets in DC. You know, we have come to a point where value for money is expressed in basis points, when in fact it should be whether the end client gets exactly what we promised we would deliver. Then it shouldn't matter how much it costs. But we have still this kind of taboo topic that we try to do the right thing, but we don't dare touch the other part of the jigsaw in how we can make it work. So that's for another day. But I wanted to pick up the fabulous question on the just transition, because you're spot on, of course. There's an immediate conflict that we all know that if you adjusted pricing of average day goods for the carbon that is particular, you know, take the T-shirt from Primark that comes normally from India or Bangladesh. We don't adjust for the carbon that's produced all the way until it's here. It cannot cost £1.50. But of course, it is exactly those people that have been extremely hard hit by the inflation backdrop and the shocks we had in various pieces. And we are seeing it now, of course, in all the elections that people are saying, we can't. We see our standards of living erode. And of course, you can't tell them all of a sudden, no, you have to bear the brunt of if we now do carbon adjustment. That's where the open debate comes in. Because I'm coming back, this is a conflict, but we need to solve it, right? Because if we don't change and if we don't allow for the carbon that is embedded in all of these products, we will not get to the end point. But it shouldn't be that those people and those households get the additional burden on top of it. And this is where I believe governments and policies have to come in to acknowledge, to look for the right answer. And this is even before we come to the just transition between the North and the global South, right? It is in a similar context where the burden of the transition will fall on average household incomes that can't deliver, right? So what we have in the small here is a global phenomenon, and I don't think gets enough attention to make it work.
Okay, I'm going to go to Maria. Super short, super fast, super punchy, and then we'll wrap up.
Hi, I'll be quick. I know you like breaking panel rules, Rory, so I'm going to help you break the rules, and I'm going to try and answer the question rather than ask the question. Very, very briefly, the private markets question, given how important it is, you know, for all of us to make sure that DC outcomes are improved and how private markets play a role in this. We are genuinely living in unprecedented times, and we're on the cusp of massive, huge change in DC market. It's going to be unrecognizable with all the plans that the government are now coming forward. It's going to be a totally different ballgame. We're going to see more of a kind of Australia or Canada-like pension system. It's going to happen, I think, pretty quickly. And we're going to see the change in investment strategies. And even before we see all this drive for growth and consolidation, we already can see the change in investment strategies because large providers are already doing it. So Fidelity, Aegon, Phoenix have announced it. L&G are doing it with us. It's happening, right? And all the others who are not doing it, they're rumored to be working on it, which means they're probably working on it. So just wanted to kind of have a positive statement on this. I think we're there, and we're going to see that change materialize very quickly.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Maria. So that was, for those of you who may not know, Maria Nazarova-Doyle from IFM. But I just assume you're famous, Maria, so. Okay, panel, we're slightly over time, so very last question. You've spent the last 45 minutes and 50 minutes explaining the challenges you face and how you're trying to address them. It is now your chance to say, what is the one thing that somebody else in this room could do to help you address those challenges? Let's not have everybody blame Mark for everything that's wrong in the world. So Mark, equally, you're not allowed to say, don't blame the regulator. But maybe I could ask you to start. What's the one thing that one of these stakeholder groups or another stakeholder group could do to allow us to make substantial progress on net zero?
I'm going to say engage and collaborate. I think there's some space for greater collaboration between schemes, noting some of the commercial challenges. But equally, as a regulator, we want to engage more. We want to understand what the challenges and the barriers are to see how we can help shape the policy and practice moving forward and address things like the ever-increasing reporting burden so that things are adding value, not just taking up time for compliance's sake. So, yeah, collaboration and engagement.
Thank you, Mark. Naomi?
Yeah, I think mine would be similar, but specifically, I think for us it would be other schemes engaging with their own regulators, governments, whether that's UK or globally, to address sort of these systemic challenges that we face.
Thank you. Sonja?
Yeah, I guess the cooperation across asset managers would have a similar impact, right? If we consider that we're all sending different data requests to all companies, it's not helpful. We're not achieving what we could achieve if we were to collaborate more. There's good starting points. Then I come back to the global aspect, because if we just do it here in Europe, we will not probably have the same impact. So global cooperation probably is the one aspect that would help the most.
Thank you. And David, thank you.
So in the end, climate change is a policy game. The policy has to change to get to that just transition point. It's not individual companies, it's not individual investors, and not individual pension funds that can do this. Global policy has to change, and the investment sector, asset owners need to be better at engaging with policymakers to counteract what is happening from the other side. And getting the right people in the room. There's no point having the head of ESG, head of responsible investment, engaging with policymakers. It's got to be the trustees, the CEOs, the CIOs doing it, because that sends the weight of money signal to the policymakers.
Audience, the panel have given you a message. The message is to collaborate and collaborate globally. Let us take the first step in that, in giving their biggest round of applause to the panel for their thoughtful, generous comments.